For Unit 5, I'm doing my presentation on an article entitled How to Seek Reasonable Accommodation in the Workplace for a Physical or Mental Disability, written by Archibald Thomas for the Employee Rights Quarterly. Mr. Thomas is an attorney on the employee side, and he wrote this article to help people with disabilities comply with the American Disabilities Act and the Rehabilitation Act in order to obtain reasonable accommodations for the disability. The government body that regulates this is called the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And I chose this article because it did an excellent job of setting forth the interactive process for employees and employers to work together to come to reasonable accommodations. Now, what are reasonable accommodations? These can include changes to the job application process to allow an individual with disabilities to be considered for hire. It can involve changes to the work environment to enable an individual with disabilities to perform essential functions of the job. It can relate to changes that allow the individual to enjoy benefits and privileges of the job similar to those similarly situated employees without disabilities. Examples of reasonable accommodations include job restructuring, part-time or modified work schedules, acquiring or modifying equipment used for the job, changing tests, training materials, and policies related to the job, and providing qualified readers or interpreters. It also can include reassignment of the employee to a vacant position. Things that are not reasonable accommodations are governed by a standard of undue hardship or excessive expense or disruption for the employer. So things that are not accommodations that are required are elimination of an essential function of the job, lowering production standards, or providing personal use items needed to complete the job. Now, the interactive process is required by the EEOC regulations, and it requires the employee and the employer to engage in this interactive process in order to determine appropriate and reasonable accommodations. It's an informal process. It's used to identify the precise limitations that the employee has and how to address them. There are 4 steps. First, the job is to be analyzed to determine the purpose and essential functions of the job. Second, there's consultation with the employee to ascertain the limitations and how they can be overcome. Third, there's consultation with the employee to identify potential accommodations. And fourth, the employer is required to consider the preference of the employee in selecting the most appropriate accommodation. Now, courts have imposed a duty on both the employer and the employee to act in good faith, which is a term often used in negotiations and bargaining, including collective bargaining concepts. Archibald, the author of the article, suggests ways to make the interactive process most effective, including having direct face-to-face dialogue. He suggests that the employee obtain medical records that address not only the diagnosis and prognosis of the disability, but also specifically how to comply with the specific provisions of the ADA. Archibald also suggests employees providing specific and complete written requests to the employer, because that will help if this all falls apart and there needs to be subsequent litigation. Archibald also suggests the employee be specific as to how major life activities are affected, especially if it's not readily apparent. An example of this would be sleeping difficulties or problems interacting with others caused by the disability. Now, while the EEOC requires employee preferences to be given deference, the employer is not required to select that what the employee would want. If there are several accommodations that exist that are all reasonable, it is the employer's prerogative as to which one to choose. But ultimately, Archibald counsels that knowledge is power. The employee must read and study up on the provisions of the ADA and the regulations from the EEOC, and suggests getting good medical documentation. But ultimately, his advice is whatever the employee feels they need, just ask for it. Sometimes even things that aren't covered by the ADA may be agreeable to the employer for a variety of reasons. Thank you.